So we looked at Native American religion just a little bit, not in any sort of systematic way in Chapter 1. Now we're revisiting it in Chapter 21. And, you know, in the United States, Native Americans would fit under what in religious studies we call indigenous religions. So we're talking about, you know, religions of tribal peoples in Africa, in Asia, in Polynesia, and places like that. And they all kind of get lumped in together. And it's one thing to look at them sort of in the abstract as separate from everything else. But a lot of times, I think you guys probably realize this by now, religions are interacting with each other. They're not existing in a vacuum. And all sorts of non-religious forces have a role on what happens. So that's part of what's going on in the story in this chapter. So we're looking at Christian missions because, you know, why? Well, it was only Christians carrying them out. Jews were not interested in converting Native Americans, and Christians were pretty much the only game in town. They're divided into a bunch of different denominations, and we'll talk about how that played out. But, you know, that's the main dynamic going on. And your book talks about, you know, what did they think about the Native Americans? Did they understand where they came from? The answer is no, right? At first, it's total misrecognition. Why does Columbus call them Indians? Because he thinks that he's where? Yeah, he actually thought he hit India, and then after a while he realized his mistake. And that's not really what we're worried about. What we're more interested in is how did missions work? How did they play out? What sort of effects did they have? And one of the things that we want to do is distinguish between a couple different models, national models, that we can talk about. And the Spanish approached things differently than the French did, who approached things differently than the English did, and the English were divided into a couple different groups. And even with the Spanish, you have a couple different sub-models playing themselves out. The way they approached Native Americans, if they were Franciscans, was different than if they were Jesuits. Remember when we talked about Catholicism, there's these religious orders. This is when that sort of thing starts to matter. So your book begins by talking about a couple different agents or players on the scene. One of the things you want to avoid when you're thinking about Christian Native American interactions is lumping everybody into one category, because that's just sort of sloppy work and sloppy thinking. With the Spanish, who would be the main people on the scene? Don't just think about religion. Think about who are the Spaniards that are coming over here and doing things in one way or other, positive or negative. So, I mean, we know we have the clergy, right? But who else? Who else is a player? Yeah.
Conquistadors.
Yeah. And what does that translate to?
Conquerors.
Exactly. Yeah, they were there to conquer. So sometimes we place them in the realm of explorers, but they were exploring basically to conquer things, mainly looking for gold or other valuable items. And along the way, they started realizing, hey, these to use the paraphrase the title, guns, germs, and steel give us an incredible advantage over these native civilizations. So we're going to take them over. We're going to fight them. Horses help too. Who else plays a role but not directly on the scene? It would be the Spanish state or crown. And all three of these might have different goals, different aims. The conquistadors are interested in deriving wealth, power, and how did they treat the Native Americans? They enslaved many of them, they killed many of them. They were not particularly interested in learning anything about their cultures. The king, or queen, depending on what time we're talking about, is back in Spain, doesn't have a lot of local control. Any local control that would be exercised would be by governors, and governors' power would only extend as far as their soldiers went. But they're mostly interested in what? Keeping order, making sure that things don't, completely degenerate. And they and the conquistadors might not see eye to eye. The clergy, what are they interested in? They have a whole different agenda. What are they all about? Just saying Mass? You guys get into it because they like saying Mass all the time. Saying Mass to Native Americans is just as much fun. Probably not, right? What is their goal? When they're not, conquistadors in disguise or something like that. What do they want to do? This is the issue of mission. What's their whole way of life about? I mean, think about it. If you want to be a priest, you got to give up a lot of stuff, don't you? If you're a Catholic priest. Other priests too, but no sex for you. You got to take vows of obedience. If you're in a religious order, you may not like who you're obedient to. Poverty, quite often. That's a lot to give up. Why do people do this? They just needed a place to stay? I don't think so. What attracted them, especially to going overseas? Instead of hanging out in Spain, where at least you know what things are like and everybody speaks the language, why go over to the wilds of America, where the food might kill you, the animals might kill you, the diseases might kill you? Why do all that? Are we that distant from this sort of time that it's hard to relate to their motives? And people still go on mission work today. Just met a kid last week who's going on mission. Ironically, he's going on mission to England. Because they've become so de-Christianized that people send missions to European countries now. They want to bring Christianity, right? I mean, are the conquistadors bringing Christianity? They're just bringing fire and sword. Any crosses they make are probably not going to be, connected with Jesus Christ in any way, in any tangible way. Is the king doing it? Not really. He leaves that in the hands of the clergy. So the question is then, how do you actually bring Christianity to Native Americans? And there's a couple different models for this. And so with the Spanish, we can talk about three different models that your book goes over. It talks about Mexico, and in Mexico you had a very highly developed civilization, the latest rulers of which on the scene were the Aztecs. Actually, the Aztecs were so brutal that the other people were praying for the Aztecs to be overthrown, because there had been just succession after succession of civilization. When Cortez came, some of the people actually welcomed him because they didn't like the Aztecs. But then, if they'd known much about Cortez, they probably, wouldn't have been so welcoming. The Spanish, once the clergy show up, they try to superimpose the Catholic Church and all of its rituals and all of its ideas onto sort of an Aztec basis. So like your book mentions, they tried to superimpose the material presence of their religion on the remains of the shrines of the Aztecs. So the cathedral in Mexico City, prime example, it's actually erected on the scene of one of the temples. This is not a new thing, by the way. Christians did this in Europe when they took over some of the at that time pagan areas when they were carrying out conversion. They would build a church on top of the site of an ancient temple. So like the book says, they were imposing their own version of cosmos. We've talked about this before, cosmology, order, onto what they perceived as the chaos of the Aboriginal habitations. And this also allowed them to create administrative units, to put things into a settled state. Now, they thought that what they were doing was imposing this on the chaos. The chaos is just a mixture of things. For the Aztecs, they already had a very complex developed civilization. They actually had a cosmology. As a matter of fact, they thought they were living in the 5th age. There was an entire succession of destruction of the world and then rebirth of the world. Different gods were in charge of it. And some Aztecs actually said that the coming of the Spanish was the destruction of the 5th world and the beginning of the 6th world. The book doesn't really talk about that, but it's an interesting side note. Now, these missionaries tried to, like I said, master the native languages and devise new approaches to evangelization, new approaches to converting people, to bringing the message of Christianity to them. So, open-air churches were something you can do in that area. Why? Because it doesn't rain all the time. It's pretty dry. You can pack a lot more people in there. Were they successful in learning these native languages? Only partially. And it's really because of the missionaries and their writing things down that we have many of the records of the Aztecs, for example. But they were only partially successful. And like the book points out, the Spanish clergy regarded the Indians as perpetually dependent, and the order they imposed on their charges was what we call paternalistic. Is this a term you guys are familiar with, paternalism? When somebody is paternalistic, they're treating you like a child. Like they're, you're their kid, they're the dad. Used to be that colleges were like that. So perhaps you still have advisors that are kind of paternalistic. They don't let you pick your own classes, and they tell you, well, you're going to take this and this and this. That would be what we're talking about here. Now, some of the other approaches that the Spanish had can be looked at in terms of other geographical areas. So we go from a place with immense city-states, and now we want to look at somewhat less developed, at least in material culture, civilizations. So now we're looking at the American Southwest, New Mexico. And there we have a number of different peoples that are all sort of lumped into this classification of the Pueblos. The Hopi are a particularly good example. How many of you have ever gone to a museum, because you see a lot of this in museums, and seen Hopi kachina or artwork or things like that? Have any of you seen these sorts of things? You can find them if you go down to the city, go to the Natural History Museum, you'll see this sort of stuff. And it's worth taking a look at. Because those kachina, they're both dolls and masks, and they're part of these societies. And that's part of the ancestral religion that these people were practicing. There's a lot of really sophisticated discussions about exactly what do they symbolize and how do they work. And do the people believe that these objects really have any inherent power, or are they merely symbolic and representative? You can find a lot of great discussion of that. The missionaries that went in those areas, like your book points out, really did not do a good job in producing conversion. Why not? Well, because they just tried to impose Christianity by force. And you know how it is when somebody tells you what to do. You don't want to do it, they impose it by force. Does that make you want to do it anymore? Not usually. And if you already have a long-standing, very tightly knit group, you can probably resist for a very long time. And the way that a lot of people do this sort of resistance is by what your book calls compartmentalizing. So you tell people one thing, and then you go off and do another thing. And that's what they would do. The people and the priests for these ancestral religions would continue their rites in secret and tell the priests, yeah, sure, I'll whatever you say, Father, I'll go to Mass, I'll get baptized. But then they said, that none of that matters. We're going to keep doing this over here. And so they, the missionaries tried to stamp this sort of thing out, but they were highly unsuccessful, and Christianity didn't leave much of a mark, predictably enough. So your book talks about the organization of their voluntary societies, and I leave that to you to read and think about. Another approach is what happened in California. How many of you have ever been out to California and seen the missions?
Oh.
So you have been out to California?
Yeah.
So they talk about this royal road. And then they talk about these mission churches along there. And each of these mission churches was supposed to be about one day's march away from the other one, so they could be in contact with each other. And this was a different model that the Spaniards were doing there. So this guy Junipero Serra, he organizes all these missions, 21 mission stations, along this royal road from San Diego to San Francisco. And what does he do there? He invites the native inhabitants to come and help him out. He doesn't try to convert them. He doesn't, get up there and say, this is the book you must believe in. Everybody line up for baptism. Instead, he says, hey, I need some help building these buildings. Would you mind helping me out? And you can see sort of this fusion going on because part of the architecture is definitely Spanish and part of it is adapted to the local circumstances. Now, once these missions are being built, like he says, the compounds were designed to be self-sustaining. Each of these is supposed to be its own little community. And they began to farm, and it was quite successful. Under the Franciscan tutelage, the natives raised cattle, sheep, olives, grape, and other produce. Now, notice, are grapes native to, there's wild grapes, but are grapes of the sort that he's talking about native to California or olives? Not really. He's transplanting a lot of Spanish culture there, and he's offering it as something that they can make part of their own life. At the same time, he's instructing them in the rudiments of Christianity. He's not demanding that they do that, but he's doing that. Mission priests, so this is the European priests coming in, were expected to master the native language within a year of their arrival. And that turned out to be something very important for conversions. That also had to do with the French and to a lesser extent with the English. If you expect other people to adapt themselves to your language, and if their languages are very different, they may see the world in very different ways. If you don't learn their language, it's much less likely that they're going to take you seriously. You have to be able to adapt your concepts into other people's language. This is a basic of communication, right? You learn this in your speech classes. You have to adapt yourself to the audience. So that's what they were doing. Now, why did this fall apart? Because they no longer exist as communities today. Well, once Mexico as a state took over, they engaged in what your book calls secularization of the settlements. That means that they turned them into no longer religious establishments, but state establishments. And then when the Americans came in, they did the same thing, and the community just sort of died out. So unfortunately, they weren't any more successful in converting people either. So what about the French? The French are in a different area, or different areas. The Spanish are dealing with some areas where you've got massive city-state civilizations with millions of inhabitants. Then, these Pueblo villages. The French are dealing with areas where a lot more hunting-gathering is going on, some semi-nomadic civilizations where they pick up stakes every so often. The Huron would be a good example in terms of that. And the French are there for other reasons. The Spanish, were looking for gold. They wanted to take over areas. Eventually colonization becomes a major thing. The French were there to get one thing, well, really, two main things to begin with. One is to get hides, to get fur, to set up trading posts. And the other was to carry out conversions. And with the French, the ones who are particularly successful are the Jesuits, the Black Robes. The Jesuits had a sort of checkered history in France. Every once in a while, they would get a little too political and get themselves in trouble. They actually got themselves in trouble with the papacy a couple times too. Your book mentions the Jesuits going to China and trying to translate the Bible into Chinese. That actually set off a huge controversy because they used the word for heaven, tian, to represent God, because there wasn't an adequate concept of monotheistic conception. And that people were saying these Jesuits, they go a little bit too native. They adapt themselves a little bit too much to the local cultures. But that made them particularly strong when it came to blending in, to forming communities that were Christian communities, but also at the same time indigenous communities. So they talk about a couple different examples of this. One in particular that we want to look at is the Hurons. And here we see again that outside forces, even when you are successful in carrying out mission work, outside forces can come in and destroy it. Because what happens? The Hurons are missionized by the Jesuits. Like it says, they began to work among the Hurons beginning in 1625, and they set about learning the language and immersing themselves in native culture. Just to give you an idea of how the Jesuits work, first generation of the guys on the scene, think of them as the advanced team. They wouldn't try to convert anybody. You know what they would do? Figure out, what's what. Learn the language. You can't do anything until you actually know what people are saying. They'd learn the language, they'd learn the culture, they'd learn how to cook the food that the people ate, they would start to mix with them. Quite often, they would attain some sort of status in those societies, whether it was, a complex society like China or a tribal society like the Huron. Then the second generation would come in, and this is really quite brilliant. The first guys would brief them. They would say, here's the grammar that I developed of this language. Learn it, because you're going to need it. And they were the ones who were then going to start carrying out the mission work. And then by the third generation, you'd have 2 generations of people there who had long-standing ties with the native community, who knew the language, who could tell you as you're coming in, here's what you have to watch out for, and don't eat this, by the way, because it's going to make you sick. And see that guy over there, he's an important person to talk to. And here's the background assumptions that you need to keep in mind. So they were extraordinarily successful when they didn't run into outside problems. In the case of the Hurons, the outside problems came in terms of their ancestral enemy, the Iroquois, who decided to try to wipe the Huron out. And they were pretty successful. They destroyed the Huron society effectively as any sort of viable, alternative to them. And they ended up killing a lot of the missionaries, too, in the process. Your book talks about Jean Brebeuf and how he was actually admired by the Iroquois because he stood up to their torture. And some of the tortures that they did were pretty horrific. Bless you. But this is, so in a way this is successful, but in a way it's also unsuccessful. So let's talk now about the English. What's different between the French, English, and Spanish? Right off the bat. The French and Spanish, we've been talking about Catholics, right? Who are we talking about with respect to the English? Yeah.
Protestants.
Yeah, so we're talking about a variety of Protestants. When it comes to Catholics, you can say, well, at least they're all supposed to be on the same page. 7 sacraments, apostolic succession, Pope over there in Rome, all that sort of stuff, right? And we see that there's a lot of variance even with Catholics. But with Protestants, they're not all members of the same church. They've already split apart from each other, so they may have very different approaches towards the Native Americans. And that's what we see them actually doing. So, if you look at the Puritans, did the Puritans manage to do much? Not really. In part because most Puritans were totally uninterested in converting the Native Americans. They, in theory, Native Americans could go to heaven. It might be part of the Society of the Saints, but it's an awful lot of work to try to communicate with them. Your book does talk about this guy, John Eliot, in the Bay Colony. Notice what he does. One of the first things that he does is produce a grammar and a dictionary of the Massachusetts language. Translates the New Testament and other Christian works into their language. So he's doing the same sort of pattern that rendered people like the Jesuits successful. But he's doing it as a Protestant, and he organizes them into these praying towns. Now, in these praying towns, they're pretty much expected to give up a lot of their Native American identity, but the Catholics are demanding quite a bit of the same as well. Once again, we see outside forces, in these praying towns. Coming in. Would the praying towns have been an effective experiment? We don't know. Why not? Well, because a war breaks out. And they take a lot of the Native Americans who are in the praying towns and put them into concentration camps. And the praying towns effectively cease to exist along with those people, most of whom die in these concentration camps. What else? He talks about some other missionaries who had very little success. A few Native Americans went to Harvard, found out that it was they were being told you have to give up being a Native American, and some of them actually die at Harvard because of the difficulty of adapting themselves to that. It sounds kind of strange, right? You'd go to school and die. But, think about it. If you have a particular diet, a way of life that you're adapted to, and you're forced into a radically different way of life, that can have severe physical effects. And that's what happened. He does talk about a few other things, these Moravians, who we've encountered before. Remember, they're part of the Anabaptist tradition. Among the peace churches, and the Moravians, actually the Pietist tradition, right? They're influenced by the Anabaptists. The Moravians carry out mission work among them and are somewhat successful, but then what happens? The book tells you they have to leave these towns during the Revolution. When they come back, the frontiersmen massacre the Native Americans. So that fails as well. The Quakers, or Friends, carry out mission work. And again, successful beginnings, but a lot of times these things would just founder. So, what's the common theme so far? Nothing really has worked particularly well in terms of providing some sort of distinct, some sort of, two things. Something that would actually provide a way in which Native Americans would not have to give up all of their identity and yet could become Christians that would be in fellowship with European Christians. None of these experiments are completely successful. After that, after the Revolution, we enter a new phase. And in this new phase, like your book talks about, the Protestant churches channel their work through this interdenominational American Board of Commissioners of Foreign Missions, because they saw that the frontier is part of foreign territory. And like it says, the efforts of Protestant missionaries were not very productive. Why? Because there's this insistence that you have to completely change your way of life, that religion equals culture. So taking on the religion means getting rid of indigenous culture. And your book gives you a lot of examples of this, so I don't need to go over that. Another thing that causes a lot of disruption with this is the reservation policy. So what is that? This is talking about a little bit later. Native Americans, there's a shift in what's going on in the federal government. They're placing them on reservations. And reservation sounds kind of good at first. It's like, set aside for you. But what kind of land would they usually reserve for the Native Americans out on the frontier? Anyone remember from their history classes or Yeah.
The land no one else wanted.
Yeah. Because as the frontiersmen are pushing out, they would claim land. Usually, this is how conflicts would start. The military would usually say, Europeans, whites, whatever you want to say, don't go any further than this, because this is, say, Cherokee territory, or this is Lakota territory, or this is whatever. And what do you think the Americans did? The white Americans, they would just go out there and start settling, and then pretty soon, they're settling on somebody else's land. That's like an open provocation. And soon enough, there'd be some conflict between them, and then the military would come in, and the military would take the side against the Native Americans, and the popular perception was, you can't, these Native Americans, we've got to do something about them because they're so warlike, so we'll push them off of the good land onto this marginal land, the reservations. Now, in terms of religion, why was that important? Well, the reservations were divided up by this Quaker policy that sort of apportioned different reservations to different religious denominations. So the Quakers might be in charge of this one, the Methodists in charge of this one, the Episcopalians in charge of this one. They did the same thing, by the way, in Africa, in Nigeria. This policy was tried in a lot of different places. And they didn't pay any attention to who had missionized these people beforehand. And the Roman Catholics felt kind of put out by this, so they organized their own mission boards, like it says. In general, the history of this has not been very successful. There is a sort of bright note towards the very end when they're talking about Catholic missionary work, and they're using the example of the Lakota. So Catholics and by the way, Lutherans were also out there doing mission work with Lakota. Catholics are out there, and until the time of Vatican II, really what it's consisting in is trying to de-Indianize the natives, trying to take away their identity from them, force them into schools where they're only speaking English, and essentially trying to eliminate their identity. As you can guess, totally unsuccessful. Right? That sort of thing does not work. Since Vatican II, like your book points out, the atmosphere of pluralism that spread through the Catholic Church led to a different missiology. That's a kind of useful word to know. Missiology means a philosophy of mission work. What are you up to in carrying out missions? So the Jesuits kind of led the charge on that once again, and you see a lot of things. Well, here's some examples. Some have gone so far as to participate in traditional Sioux practices, part of Lakota religion, like vision quests and sweat lodge ceremonies. There's a book, by the way, if you're interested in it, called The Pipe and Christ, which talks quite a bit about this. It's actually by a guy who was a Jesuit missionary and tries to find parallels between the sacraments and the 7 religious ceremonies, and talks about that sort of thing. So you might go to, since Vatican II, you might go to a reservation and see a priest actually performing the Mass in traditional Native American gear. And that would be considered, okay. For the most part, what are we looking at here? Mostly a tragedy. The interaction between these two main groups, you could say, didn't work out that well. And we're going to revisit Native Americans a little bit later. This is something to keep in mind, why the ghost dance would become popular. Because the Native Americans were so alienated by what was going on in mission work that they might want something very different.